I would like to propose that we extend the discussion time up to 2:45, 2:45, so we have a little bit more time to, ask questions and make comments. Before opening the floor, I'd like to ask you, before taking the floor, to say who you are and state if you have any affiliations, and also particularly welcome inputs from those who are following online. If you have questions to pose or you want to share a comment, please do write, and they will be shared with us. Thank you. Where should we start? Okay, should we start here? Front row. 3 in the front row.
Elsa Dawson, Independent Development Consultant. I'd just like to know what the panel think about the awarding of the Peace Prize to Barack Obama, and whether they think that's constructive or not in terms of world peace.
Peter Tesh, I'm a media advisor with the Indonesian Embassy. I would like to continue about the paradoxes. One of the paradoxes I'm dealing with at the moment is that we're getting complaints in about Indonesian stoning laws, but there are no Indonesian stoning laws. There are stoning laws in Aceh. So the price of the peace in Aceh was to give the separatist Islamists autonomy. They're using it to introduce a certain legal system which is contradictory to the Indonesian legal system because it's a secular system, but which was but under the international community and the activists and the advocates wanted to give this autonomy. And I just wonder, are the activists and the advocates, are they wanted their cake and eat it, or are they taking the biscuit?
James.
Thank you. My name's James Morton. I worked for some years in Darfur, and I'm an independent consultant and development economist. I'm struggling here because I'm so in tune with what all the speakers have said about the need for the international community to stop preaching, stop overloading what it presents, to please God, take a sensible time frame to the interventions that it makes. But I'm not entirely convinced by Alex's suggestion that if we pull the international community right out, we go back to some, what's the phrase, some early man heaven where society worked so well. Because it's pretty obvious in Sudan, I think in Afghanistan, and there are several other examples of these countries. Yeah, they were functioning systems. They were fairly brutal, but there was an element of justice. Everybody understood where they stood. They were not democratic. But in the example of Sudan, I think it's pretty clear that when the international force of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium was withdrawn, the system was functioning, but it was unstable, and it was unstable long before the international community got there. So as I say, I'm so much in sympathy with what's been said by everybody, but I still don't think we're that much closer to a solution.
I'll take another couple and then I'll get back to the pan.
My name's Richard Brown, affiliated to PRD, University of York. I'd particularly like to address this to Kieran. Does he think that, in view of his idea that we shouldn't rush into summits and settlements and circles too quickly, bearing in mind that was done to some extent with GFAP, the peace agreement of Bosnia and the Balkans, does he think that that's now been, looking back, what are we, 14 years so onwards, does he think that that's been a success or not, or whatever? Thanks.
Thanks, and I'll take the lady here and then I'll come to you later.
Puni, British Tamil Women for Justice and Peace. Sri Lanka, that is one of the most complex, one of the most vicious conflicts, intrastate conflicts, that the third party will have to understand it very clearly. It's so complex that they will have to make extra efforts to understand it. This is conflicts. All conflicts have some similarities, but they have peculiarities as well. But this peculiarity about Sri Lanka is that internal colonialism for more than 6 decades, in an island, in a geopolitically sensitive position, with an ethnic majority that is not willing to give anything to the ethnic minorities. They want to keep on oppressing them. How do you work this out? Only a third party can resolve this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir Kieran, there was a question directed to you. Would you like to answer that and then address any other?
Well, my comment about the tendency towards summits was not specific to the Balkans. It's just an increasing feature of international life that you have summits, and summits have to be successful. And very often the issues that are being dealt with are not susceptible to quick fixes. I mean, you may need years and years and years to deal with things, and the tendency therefore is to paper over cracks. Now, in the Balkans, I think there was plenty of unfinished business left by Dayton and otherwise, but Bosnia is hanging together. I don't think that invalidates my point. It was more that actually this is a feature of modern life. While I've got the floor, however, I did want to say that one thing we didn't talk about. But it's kind of come up in both Fink and Alex's comments, is that a lot of the negotiations one is talking about to resolve these conflicts are negotiations between elites on both sides. And people have talked about the concept of rotating elites. So you're actually assisting the rotation from one elite to another. And there is another concept that I've heard recently, which is transformational negotiations. I mean, it seems to me that the existing system is actually difficult enough to be getting on with, but nevertheless, there's a rather attractive side to the idea that we should be thinking about how do you transform a whole society to bring about stability rather than just alternating one apparently corrupt elite for another.
Thank you very much. Do you want to address any other of the points that were raised?
Use of force. I think on Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is interesting because there's been a kind of assumption in the rest of our discussion that conflicts are brought to an end by a political settlement and political dialogue and negotiation and so on. And here you have one which is being brought to an end for now, anyway, by the use of force. I think that. I can't remember whether it was Fink or Alex who said that ceasefires break down if they're not in support of a negotiation. Whoever said it was absolutely right. Ceasefires are not an end in themselves. They're a way of buying some time and some space in which negotiations have to take place. And if there is no negotiation, then as night follows day, the ceasefire is almost inevitably going to break down. And by the way, usually it breaks down as a result of the weaker party breaking it because the stronger party is in possession of political power. The other point I would make in that connection is that shock and awe don't last forever, as we found in Iraq, as we found in Afghanistan. It's very rare that you can definitively solve a problem just by the use of force.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to reply to James and other?
I think Barack Obama should have been given the Mo Ibrahim Prize for African Leadership. It's worth a lot more than the Nobel Peace Prize as well. I think on Peter's question, I think, and actually this addresses James's point too, we can't go in to try and mediate a solution with an idea that you can have a utopian outcome that means you get peace, justice, reconciliation, democracy, development, everything together. And the sort of the expectation that is being generated that a peace process that somehow falls short on any one of those is a failure is I think an error of the ideal being an enemy of the good. And I think the entry of this sort of comprehensive activism, which is both human rights, justice, peace, everything is into this field is actually problematic, because you can't. It's just completely unworkable. And I think the reason why we're concerned about these countries, this is James's point, is because they are in conflict, and they weren't, despite the many errors and crimes of colonialism. In many cases, in most cases, the conflict is not at least directly engendered by colonial rule. They are societies that need to be, fairly radically fixed. But I think that the process of getting there is not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. But the key thing is we have to start from what is there and what at least functions to some degree in those societies. I wouldn't advocate complete pulling out, but I would say quite a lot of pulling back. For example, I think that the UNAMID mission in Darfur is about 10 times too big. I think it would function better with a tenth of its current size.
Thanks.
Let me respond briefly to two of the questions which, on Aceh and on the Dayton, which raised the question as to the proper role of the international community. I think it's legitimate for the international community to be engaged where there is war, where there is destruction of life and the killing of civilians. And so I think I wouldn't advocate a withdrawal and a hands-off policy at all. But I think when you're starting to deal with the constitution of a country, there's obviously a more limited role. As that discussion or that engagement moves from helping and maybe twisting arms to get a peace agreement to one in which the citizens of a country come to a deal amongst themselves as to how they will live together, there is less and less place for international pressure. The way I see the role I've frequently played is that what I can bring to the table for the actors is an expanded imagination through comparative constitutionalism. I can give them ideas which they may not have thought through themselves, because I think in constitutionalism, as with culture and everything else, we're captives of our past and our experience and hostages to that which we know. And I think human beings have a capacity to find solutions to a wide range of problems, if not all of their problems, provided they have the imagination. We can help provide that imagination, but we can't twist the arms as to how they can live together. And I think the issue which Sir Kieran raised was the way in which, certainly in Iraq, the Iraqis were rushed to find that contract in order to meet a U.S. domestic political goal of a benchmark which would indicate some success on the part of the Bush administration for their engagement in Iraq. And it's had, quite frankly, negative consequences. And what we're seeing now in Iraq is a deep desire by Iraqis to re-examine that social contract and to find a more inclusive setting in which they can engage with each other, the components of the society and the citizens amongst themselves, to find a fit, to find a compact between them which fits more appropriately.
Thank you, Fink. James at the back, Judith, and there were two colleagues over there. And then I'll come again.
Thank you. I'm James Darcy. I'm head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. I wanted to pick up on the point that Nocholas Haysom was making about the nature of these political settlements and what political processes they set in train. Clearly, we're concerned here more as much about a process that involves the people concerned as about the contesting parties who purport to represent them. We tend to focus on processes that are national. We set in train national election processes, and when those go wrong, as they have in Zimbabwe or in Afghanistan now, we talk about power sharing arrangements and so on. Alex, you said rightly, I think, that we tend to define fragile states by what they're not. One of the things they're not is they don't have strong central institutions, and we, in our anxiety to build those central institutions, I wonder if we neglect the more local institutions, the more provincial institutions. Do we think, in other words, enough about devolution of power in constructing political processes?
I might not need the microphone. I'll go ahead. First, a very warm thanks to all the speakers. And in a way, this comment or question is going to be the flip side of the last one, which I also agree with totally on the local. And that is, hearing us speak and consider these things, I'm struck by the dichotomy we always frame between the international community and those national settings, when in fact some of the pushes and pulls and patronage systems are very regional. I'm thinking in Nepal, where it can't be a coincidence that a rather beautifully crafted agreement, which came out of people power, if you like, and the coming out onto the streets of people who wanted the monarchy down in a new state, a new vision. It can't be a coincidence that the failure of the integrated army and the marginalization of the Maoists is not that far from what possibly would have been acceptable in Delhi, who have a lot of internal issues to do with Maoist rebellions, and how far do you take a Maoist card in politics? So it's what are the regional pulls and regional winks and nods and patronage systems that happen. We have an opposite or mirroring of that in Bosnia, where the EU is hoping to have this great attractive, not hegemonic, but certainly leadership capacity which will pull Bosnians over, and the veto card being held by a Serbian entity which ostensibly doesn't have any more support in the region. But I'm assuming you come across these things all the time in your diplomacy, and are there ways to also understand things better as they are with those hidden pulls regionally that they don't defeat our belief in an international community, but they certainly work alongside it? Thanks.
Gentleman at the back.
Justin Alexander, an analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I was interested that both Fink and Alex ended their addresses with comments that in certain situations it might be helpful to move beyond kind of polarizing majoritarian electoral processes. And I wonder if there are specific examples of peace processes where mechanisms have been developed which have achieved that successfully, or ones recently where it would have been helpful if there had been a different electoral system which hadn't led to such polarization. Thanks.
Thanks. Can you pass the microphone behind, please?
Thank you. I'm Peter Owen, a former government economist and governance advisor, and now an occasional freelancer. I noted at various stages, I've got 3 points actually. The first one is about the distinction between the what and the how of things that are done. We heard that about peace agreements, and we also heard that about the international community. And some of the what is fairly clear, and one of these points is understanding the context better and developing a different approach sometimes to negotiations. But what we haven't covered yet is the how is this to be done? What will it take to get more effective contributions from the international community? Do people need to work harder, get up an hour earlier or something like that, employ cleverer people? Or do they need a change of mindset? Do they need to understand more deeply the sort of things that Alex was talking about? Understanding how patronage and rent management systems work. The sort of things that Douglas North is talking about in his new book about limited access orders, and the importance, the overriding importance of using patronage to control violence, a point which Robert Bates made several years ago in his book. So the how of the international contribution to peace building, how is this to be done more effectively? And then the second point, which is a bit related, we heard about the defects of agreements that don't spell out all the how, to which one response might be, well, what about the role of diplomatic ambiguity in getting people at least to agree to stop conflict and provide some space for more effective work later on. And then finally, the third point. What about this question of winning decisively as a means to end a conflict, or the parties each abandoning hope that any of them can win decisively without negotiation? I think that was a huge factor in driving a settlement in South Africa, the perception by the rulers that they could not continue to win decisively against the others. And I have heard it mentioned in the context of Sri Lanka. I think another speaker mentioned Sri Lanka. And I think the question there is, was the international community's support for the Sri Lanka government material in encouraging them to think that they could win decisively and thereby helping to derail the peace negotiations that were going on at the time? So thank you very much.
Thanks. If it is brief, I'll take one more here and then come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. David French, Convener Associates, and I was until earlier this year Chief Executive of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. This session is entitled Political Settlements, Peace Agreements and the Road to Stability, so it's perhaps not surprising that most of the discussion has been about, political settlements has been in the context of peace agreements. But I would really appreciate hearing a bit more from each of you. And by the way, may I add my own thanks to you all. I think this has been a terrifically interesting set of presentations. But I wonder whether you would each like to say a little bit more about the place of political settlements in contexts other than those which follow conflict. What about, I mean, if we're agreed that political settlements are of one kind or another in every country of the world are an important part of long-term sustainable means of governance, then what about the importance of nurturing political settlements in pre-conflict as well as post-conflict settings?
Thank you. Who would like to start?
Let me just, if you randomly pick up some of the issues. One of the members of the audience asked us to whether we would take into account regional players. I would, and I think certainly in South Asia, India is a significant regional player, both in Nepal and I think in Sri Lanka. A study by, I can't remember who it was, one of the myriad of conflict research institutes, I think in Canada, indicated that the single greatest factor leading to the collapse of a peace process was the failure of support of the peace process by the immediate neighbors, by the region. And I think that that's true. I think peace processes need to have the region speaking with one voice and not playing politics, as we see so demonstrably in the Horn of Africa, against each other through the medium of some poor conflict country. So let me just leave it at that without tackling the specific role of India in Nepal. The jury's out, I think, on that at the moment. Justin asked the question about examples of not so majoritarian. I think there are a number of ways of blunting a majoritarian outcome in a deeply divided society. And I think we see many examples of it. I think we see the sort of South African and elsewhere government of national unity, where you more or less guarantee in advance that the winner will get a proportionate share of power, but not sole and exclusive use of power. We see instances where increasing use of regional chambers as second chambers, bringing in regions, giving more influence and power to regions, not just sort of US Senate type institutions, but when politicians come from the regions or even from other ethnic and other minorities to participate in the lawmaking process, and thus implicating, let's say, the periphery in the center. What we tried to do in Burundi is, in a proportional list system, is actually legislate that the lists had to be multi-ethnic. Now, some might say that that's an interference with the associational choices which people make and prescribing, but in the starkly polarized context of both Burundi and Rwanda, I think both societies have had to take hard measures to preclude ethnic politicization. And I think simply requiring proportionate or some equitable distribution of economic resources, either by region or else sometimes through positions to ethnic groups, for example, in the Constitutional Court and in a number of the other institutions, so that people can see themselves physically represented in the institutions of the state. There are examples of all of those, and I think we're going to see more in the future. We were asked to deal with the situation where there's been peace without a pre-conflict. I have a theory about basically phases of constitutions that we're going through. And constitutions is just, in my case, an example of a social contract, a peace agreement of a kind. I think in many developing countries, and in fact in many European countries as well, the first constitutions were essentially proclamations of identity. They were proclamations of national identity and expressions of the oneness of the members of a nation against the others, the Germans, or the colonial mother country. But in fact, what they often do is disguise the deep divisions within that society. And we see, really in the last 15 years, a number of countries throughout Africa, through Central America, and increasingly in Asia, wanting to reevaluate those social contracts, arguing that they don't appropriately reflect or cater for the diversity or the kind of geographical distribution in those societies. And just on that, I think it's not only what they're looking for, it's how they're looking for it. Increasingly, we're seeing attempts to have popular involvement in the constitution-making process rather than wise man constitution-making, precisely in order to guarantee and to ensure that there is stakeholding by a much broader and diverse group in that process. So that's at least a part response to your question about peace settlement in pre-conflict societies. Sorry, there's something else there. I can't understand my writing.
That's okay. Do you want?
Please. James, your point about devolution is I think very good, and I think it should be partly understood or interpreted in terms of making often more functional local institutions work, investing in those. Having said that, in almost all the cases that we're concerned about, the central government, because of its access to the sovereign rents of aid, etc., is disproportionately powerful, and local arrangements are not going to be very durable in the absence of getting to grips with central issues, unfortunately. Regional systems, I think, the note I wrote to myself was regional systems rather than regional factors, because I think one of the phenomena that we see in Africa, where obviously there are a lot of weak or fragile states, is you don't just simply get states having an interest but in a neighboring state, but very, very direct patronage relationships, such that in whole swathes of the continent, governments are literally bought and sold. Central African Republic being a prime example, which is just transacted in a very regionalized marketplace, and I think that's actually an irreversible phenomenon. It is now, because of the monetization of patronage over the last quarter century or so, it's actually harder to build a state than it was a generation ago. And I think we need to think creatively about the types of regional responses that are necessary. And West Africa, or the cluster of states around Guinea-Bissau, etc., that area is going to be the real test for that.
Thanks. I think I've left you with the key question of the how. We do all of that.
Well, I think we could do with the reinvention of statesmanship, or the re-emergence of statesmanship. Less short-termism, less being driven by CNN and the media, less succumbing to the temptation to simplify really complex and difficult issues to the point where politicians believe that all it needs is a phone call from Gordon to Barack, or Gordon to Erdogan, and the problem will somehow dissolve. I mean, all the knots will dissolve and the problem will be solved. Less of believing that you just have to go to a summit meeting for 12 hours and all sorts of very complex issues will dissolve. Think back to the end of the First World War in Versailles. I mean, the several heads of government and heads of state were there for months on end, and they worked out settlements which with great difficulty, but over quite a long period of time. Think about San Francisco. People were there, delegates that were there for months working out the United Nations Charter. It's actually quite difficult to envisage the drawing up of a visionary document like the United Nations Charter these days, because we don't have time. The velocity of events is such that politicians' time is divided up into very small parcels, and you drop in on Copenhagen for 4 hours. It doesn't always work. But you do. On regional players, I've got a slightly different take, which is that very often with conflicts you find that it's extremely difficult for regional players to play a prime role in resolving it because of regional suspicions of one another. For example, in Central America, you had several effective functioning states. You had Colombia, you had Mexico, and so on, but the problem in El Salvador was negotiated by the United Nations faute de mieux. I mean, it wasn't because we were the obvious people to do it. It was because the others didn't trust one another, and therefore it couldn't be done by the others. Or people don't like Big Brother. I mean, or they're suspicious of Big Brother coming in and doing it. Ditto in Guatemala. I think the case of India is quite particular because India has very special reasons for not wanting issues in its area to be internationalized, because this might set a precedent for internationalizing some of their own issues, and that's not uncommon around the world. On sort of pre-conflict settlements, one of the things I regret very much is that the war in Kosovo and exacerbated by the war in Iraq has meant that much of the third world is extremely suspicious about the concept of conflict prevention, because they see conflict prevention as a kind of euphemism for intervention, and particularly for forceful intervention. And when I was the head of department at the United Nations, we had huge difficulties with many serious third world countries about improving the conflict prevention capacity of the United Nations. Of course, you only get the conflict when the tensions which are inherent in almost any society evolve to the point where they erupt because they haven't been treated. Much better to treat them early. And we try to deal with this by coming up with all kinds of sophisticated ideas like structural prevention, to get through a series of policies that would ensure that that conflict didn't erupt, and more active conflict prevention were very heavily resisted to the point where it became actually impossible to get any meaningful increase in the capacity of the Secretariat. One last word I want to say about Burundi. I was actually in the room, no doubt you were, I think, but I was in the room with Madiba when there was a closed session with the parties, and each of the main Tutsi parties in Burundi said that we are not ready to sign this agreement. We're just not ready. It's not ripe. And Madiba said, "Thank you very much. We will now proceed to the hall and sign this agreement." And we went over, and there were about 10 heads of state on the platform. Bill Clinton turned up and was kept hanging around like the rest of us for several hours. It took about 7 hours of further negotiation before the Tutsi parties were willing to do it. Now, the consequence of that, in my view, was that groups on the insurgent groups on the other side, the Hutu groups, did keep up physical pressure on the government. First of all, it was CNDD, and then it was FDD. And I think this was a way of ensuring that they actually moved and implemented the agreements. And I think it's a painful conclusion to draw, but it's correct that there are circumstances in which the pain of standing still has to be made greater than the pain of moving. This cannot always be done by peaceful means. It cannot always be done by sanctions. And sometimes, regrettably, it is necessary for physical pressure to be brought upon a regime to ensure that it does move forward to a resolution of a conflict. Because if they're too comfortable, they won't move, and indeed, why should they?
Thank you so much. I know there are many other people that still want to speak. I can take really just two very quick comments. This side has been underrepresented. The gentleman at the back. 1, 2, and 3, and then we have to really wrap up.
Okay. I have two concerns. Nocholas, Haysom talked about the empowerment of women, their participation in peace processes. But in practice, how feasible is that? Knowing, for example, that in some developing countries, there's a high illiteracy rate, and also there's a lack of financial means for NGOs to facilitate access of certain documents like UN resolutions 1325 and other resolutions recommending participation of women in those peace processes. So how is this feasible? And secondly, talking about the international community's responsibility in sustaining peace processes, peace settlements, do you think it's possible to sustain peace settlements when the international community actors speak with discordant voices and not standing on the same position? Like, for example, I'm thinking about the case of Niger in West Africa, where the economic community of West African states and the African Union condemned the move of the president to willing to stay in power and then organizing a referendum to stay in power. And then former colonial powers like France,
I need to stop you here because we're really running out of time.
Who were accused of, because I'm a journalist, we were seeing as they did not really intervene because of interest in uranium in Niger, for example. So the international community is not speaking with one voice, and this can make peace settlements failing.
Thanks. And the gentleman there has been desperate to talk from the beginning. So.
Well, my question regarding Sudan, and after the peace agreement which had been signed about a few years ago, it seems like the southern Sudanese government is seeking separation, or planning actually for separation. Is it going to be the best solution for both parties, especially the south? And the second thing, how to go about, if that's the case, how to go about nation building or national building in particular participating the grassroots in the south, considering the diversity in tribes. And my last question is how to gain the influential part or role that UN is playing that been missed. Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Very specific, quick answers. Last question.
Let me just answer shortly a previous question. In my view, there are two conditions for a party to come to the table, only one of which is that it recognizes it can't win militarily. There are a number of countries where people recognize they can't win militarily but are prepared to live in the hurting stalemate because that's better than another option. So it requires a second condition, which is that negotiations can deliver that what it desires. So in South Africa, the belief, however mistakenly, that they could achieve what they wanted through negotiation. So there's both an objective and a subjective set of conditions. Women's participation, is it feasible? Well, in South Africa, the leaders took a decision that every party would be represented 50-50. In other words, the 4 representatives, 2 must be women. And also that there couldn't be women as in the back seat and men in the front seat. It had to be in parity. Now, I know that in, for example, Sri Lanka, not in Sri Lanka, in Burundi, there were women available, but the leaders rejected it. And the same was true in Sudan. There was an influential group of women who wanted to participate in the talks, but the men said the political party must decide. It's a political choice, and that gender insistence on gender balance would affect the strength of their delegations. So, in my view, it's political will that the place of women in traditional societies is no barrier to their participation. Is it important for the international community to speak with one voice? Absolutely. And we see in Mauritania, we can see that in Guinea at the moment. We can see it in regard to Madagascar, where the African Union, SADC, and the AU are working together. In the case of Mauritania, it's the UN, AU, and ECOWAS working together. In Guinea, it's ECOWAS. And that's an indication also, not just that the international community are increasingly speaking together, but it's also an indication of the rising influence of sub-regional organizations, SADC, ECOWAS, ASEAN, as the drivers of conflict resolution, or at the least, partners of the UN, as we're increasingly realizing the other phenomenon, how important it is to bring the region in, and that's often done through those regional groups.
Thank you, Fink, and thank you all of you for such a rich and engaging discussion today. We've gone over time, but the temptation to allow you to continue to speak was too difficult to resist. And there is no time to summarize the discussion, but there will be audio and video files on our website I think, the day after tomorrow, and a written report by the end of the week. I hope to welcome all of you to our next meeting in the series on the 5th of November. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking very much the panel for such an insightful and interesting presentation today.